This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. For this episode of the podcast, I'm in Waterbury, Vermont, and joining me, sitting across from me in their tap room, is Ryan Miller of Freak Folk. Welcome to the podcast, Ryan.
Thank you for having me, Jamie.
Freak Folk, a small little brewery here in Waterbury and a classic beer location. This area of Vermont it's got some fantastic breweries, and I've been enjoying conversations with a few. But Freak Folk came out, and it was funny. I found out about you all through my beer geek friends. Because all of a sudden it was Freak Folk Saisons. Have you had them yet? Okay. And and then I don't know. This was probably 2019ish or 2020, early before pre-pandemic, I think. And all of a sudden, a few friends started sending me some of your Saisons.
Yeah, we caught the wave right before the pandemic. So
yeah,
and then had to shift course, but
sure. So been on the radar for a little while, and I'm glad to finally get up and have this conversation. Some other brewers I've talked to here in Vermont have described you and Lillian as some of the best brewers in Vermont, and it's been nice. So we're going to dive in through the course of this conversation into both your approach to Saison and Hazy IPA, because now you make a lot of Hazy
Sounds
IPA
great,
too. Sure. And here you are in Vermont, just down the road from the Alchemist, this kind of classic, the classics of Hazy IPA. And man, when beer tourists come up to this area, they sure do want some Hazy IPA, don't they?
Oh yeah.
We're going to talk about your approach to that and how you have staked out a Freak Folk approach to Hazy IPA, but we're also going to talk about the kind of creative approach to Saison there, because I just, for whatever reason now this year, after making all of these snide jokes about Saison being not commercially viable last year, I've been drinking more Saison these days, and I think it's something we should continue paying attention to, especially.
I agree. I'd like to be able to brew more of them.
Exactly. We're gonna bring it back, and it will never hope. Yeah, we're going to celebrate the small creative producers making beautiful Saison in all the places that they're doing it, because this is an important part of beer as well. Anyway, before we talk about that, at G&D Chillers, they always strive to build great chillers. Partner with them as you build great beer, but don't take it from me.
Hey, this is Josh Erickson of Jafuncta Brewing in Mandeville, Louisiana. The team at G&D were a critical part of our 10X expansion, always just a phone call or email away. And thanks to their superior equipment, technology, and documentation, commissioning our new chiller was smooth and straightforward. Now we can't wait until we need to upgrade our existing chiller.
That's right. Choose G&D Chillers on your next expansion or brewery startup and receive 1 free year of remote control and monitoring of your new G&D chiller. And ProBrew is the industry partner the brewers trust to take their operations to the next level, especially when it comes to canning their product for distribution. By partnering with ProBrew, brewers can fill and seam their canned product. It ranges from 100 to 600 cans per minute. Their unique filling process also ensures low dissolved oxygen pickup and focuses on product quality during the entire process. For more information, visit probrew.com or email them at contactus@probrew.com. ProBrew, brew your beer. Also, you might have heard of Old Orchard, but have you heard of their newest flavors? Berry Blend, Blood Orange, Lemonade, and Tart Cherry are the latest additions to their lineup of flavored craft juice concentrate blends. Old Orchard's R&D team can also formulate custom blends unique to your needs. To learn more and request your free samples, head on over to oldorchard.com/brewer. All right, Ryan, give me a little bit of your story. What's your story? What's Lillian's story? And you should explain who Lillian is too.
Yeah.
And the whole, that background in beer and brewing, and then that arc that Freak Folk has taken as a business.
Sure. Yeah. I'm sorry that Lillian's not available today. She had some errands to run and some things to do. So
some kegs to clean.
But Lil and I have both been brewing for a very long time. I think she started before I did, out in Oregon. She worked for Oregon Trail Brewery. I think they're defunct now. I don't think they exist, but
wait, you're saying Oregon Trail Brewery died?
I believe so, yeah.
The irony.
Yeah. And then she moved out east, and I believe she worked for Magic Hat for a little while. She worked for Otter Creek for a minute.
Yeah.
And then when I met her, I was working at Otter Creek. It's kind of a weird little story, but we met at her cabin in the woods. We were both living in the woods of Ripton, and we shared a mutual friend who invited me to a party at her cabin. So that's
the most Vermont thing ever.
Absolutely. So I don't want to speak too much on her history. I wish she was here to kind of give a more thorough dive into her history. But I got into it when I was living in Pittsburgh. Well, actually, before I moved out to Pittsburgh, I was a home brewer. And then I moved out there with my girlfriend at the time, and basically just took on a bunch of part-time jobs. Eventually landed at Rock Bottom Brewery in Homestead.
Sure.
And worked there for a little while until taking on a job at Church Brew Works, if you remember that place. And then I was also part-time at Arsenal Cider House while I was out there. And then my girlfriend at the time, she was moving back to Boston, and I didn't really want to live in Boston, so I was looking at breweries kind of back home, back in Vermont, and Otter Creek just happened to post something online, so I reached out, and they brought me in for an interview, and ended up getting a job there. Yeah, there's a crazy history, actually.
Yeah.
So when I was in Pittsburgh, I met a guy named James, and him and I became like fast friends. Like we were like best buds.
Right.
When I moved out to back to Vermont to work for Otter Creek, they had posted another position, and I reached out to him saying, "Hey, you should apply for this job." And so he applied for the job, got the job, and him and I lived in Ripton together. And during that whole time we were working at Otter Creek, we were kind of like planning out our next phase, which would be to start a brewery together. So fast forward a year, we moved out to Washington, Bellingham, Washington, and started Structures Brewing. I don't know if you're familiar with that brewery. Yeah. Unfortunately, after spending a year there, we had a little bit of a falling out, and I ended up moving back home. But yeah, so there was that. And then when I moved back, I worked for Mystic Brewery for a little bit, and then I moved, moved to Connecticut, and I worked for Kent Falls for about a year. And then while I was there, I got offered a job at Tired Hands, and I worked at Tired Hands for about a year before moving back home. And then I worked as a kombucha brewer for about 3 years before. And during that time, I was like consulting for another brewery and building out my own project. And Lil and I, we kind of pooled our funds together. We asked her boss, she was working at Queen City Brewery at the time. Mm-hmm. We asked her boss if we could rent out a small footprint in his brewery, and he agreed to it. And we started buying oak and just brewing saison on the weekends and during our oak ferments, and it evolved from there. So
I love the story because there's this journeyman aspect to it, but it's also a lot of experience in a lot of different brew houses, brewing in a lot of different ways.
Absolutely. And Lil and I have our own styles, that we hone in on. So
no, it's interesting to see a lot of, all of these breweries all over the country. But it lets you feed into, to what you decided to make. So let's talk about like when you and Lil were coming up with the idea for this brewery that was going to finally be the thing that was your own, and reflect the beers that you all wanted to make for yourselves and not make for other people.
Right.
How did you define that?
Well, it kind of started, like I said, we were both living in the woods of Ripton. We were working for different breweries in Vermont at the time, but we would get together occasionally, and I'd bring some bottles. She'd have some bottles. We'd just like crack stuff open. It was usually mixed culture stuff. And we were in love with the style. Right. And we would talk about possibly starting something either on our own or together at some point. We were just friends at the time. We both love Saison, and we were friends for about 5 years before we actually like connected as a couple. And this was after my whole like moving out west and coming back and yada, yada, yada.
Sure.
And so, we got together and, started brewing the beers that we love. And actually one of the first beers that we released is cabin beer, and that's a homage to us meeting at a cabin in the woods.
life, love, and brewing together. Like it's a beautiful story.
Absolutely.
It's a beautiful story.
Yeah, it's definitely a love story interwoven into the world of craft beer.
I'm tearing up just as you tell me. I mean, it really is. That is kind of beautiful. So you then launch Freak Folk as this brewery on the side of Queen City.
Yep.
In your own, kind of the way that side project, the way that a whole bunch of other breweries have gotten started.
Yep.
But you're just making saison, which is also a nice thing to do at that time because it can ferment for a while and then it can condition for a while, and it's a slower approach to beer
Absolutely.
that can fit around your other jobs and whatnot.
Yeah, so we formed the LLC in 2018. I think we started brewing like fall or winter of 2018, and we didn't have our first release until about August of 2019. So we were fermenting when we were super nervous to launch and everything. But essentially, the brewery Queen City have their own like event space, and so we asked Paul if we could use their event space to host these bottle release events.
Sure.
Because we didn't have our own distribution channel at that point. So he was open to the idea. We launched the first 2 beers. It was actually a bigger hit than we realized. And every release from there just was bigger and bigger and bigger. We started getting lines.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was quite a thing to see.
I remember one of those early beers, Staglore.
Staglore, that was a little bit later in our first
okay.
year. I want to say that was like May 2020 or something.
Okay, maybe it was.
Yeah, because
Wow, 2020.
exactly.
Oof.
Because we we harvested the sumac in the fall and then we condition it. Yeah.
Well, I want to talk harvested the sumac. See that now we're starting into a great story because your saisons also reference the foraged nature.
Yeah, some of them do.
Yeah, some of them do, exactly. So let's transition and talk a little bit about that approach to saison, both in building saison base, maintaining mixed culture, developing your mixed culture, obviously, which you had experience with before, and then finding compelling, interesting ingredients that aren't just there to create a silly story, but also integrate well into that flavor. I want to talk about all of those things, but first, streamline efficiency with Omega Yeast Diacetyl Knockout Series. The DKO series is comprised of 8 familiar yeast strains engineered to knock out the formation of diacetyl before it starts. The strains now better, available now for made-to-order pitchables at any volume. Contact Omega Yeast today at omegayeast.com. Also, ABS Commercial has been a full-service brewery outfitter for over 10 years. They're proud to offer brew houses, tanks, keg washers, and preventative maintenance parts to brewers across the country, as well as equipment for distilling, cider making, wine making, and more. They know the ins and outs of the brewing and installation process and can design the perfect setup for you, whether you're just starting out or looking to expand. Contact them today at sales@abs-commercial.com to discuss your customized brewery needs. ABS Commercial, we are brewers. And if you're a brewer who's also interested in distilling, subscribe now to the Craft Spirits and Distilling podcast, available on all of your favorite podcast platforms. Hosted by Sidney Jones, head distiller for Fuse Spirits in Chicago, and Molly Troop, master distiller for Freeland Spirits in Portland, Oregon. This podcast explores the technical and creative processes behind great spirits through conversations with some of the leading distillers working today. It's everything you love about the Craft Beer and Brewing podcast, but focused on distilling. Click on the link in the show notes to give it a listen. So Ryan, you guys started making saison. Thought it might be kind of small. Turned out to be bigger than that. But you also wanted to take a smaller, kind of rooted, natural approach to it. How'd you go? Start making saison.
It's interesting. I mean, we were kind of limited as to what we were capable of in the space that we were in, just because when Lil and I got into this, we couldn't afford glycol jacketed tanks. We couldn't afford a chiller. All this stuff. Like I said, we just kind of pooled our funds together to start buying some oak, which were, $120 a barrel, which is a lot more feasible than $15,000 tank. So we started with the barrels. We did buy a couple Grundies for pretty cheap as well to get started. I think Paul helped us purchase our first grain order. so that's how we got started on that. But
awfully kind of him.
Yeah, absolutely. We're so grateful. for his help. But
So tell me about that process then. You start designing a Saison recipe that can handle, this pretty rudimentary approach to fermentation then.
Yeah. So like I said, we got barrels, we got a couple Grundies, and the way that we started was, the system that we were brewing on was a 14 barrel system. So we had to kind of start from there and be like, okay, well, we can't really brew like hyper small batches. So we're going to have to do like a bulk ferment, probably split it between barrels and stainless. And then we'll blend later, figure out what we're going to do with it later on. I had about...
Were you able to do primary fermentation in stainless then at Queen City, or do all the primary?
We would do both.
Okay.
We would do both. So I had about 5 different cultures that I was working with, all just weird Brettanomyces, Lactobacillus, PDO, things like that.
Where'd they come from, and how'd you keep them going?
Oh, a lot of them were just cocktails, like
Sure.
dreg cocktails. Some things that I would buy commercially and then blend in some of the cultures that I really liked,
Right.
to try to amplify some flavors. But
How would you do that? I'm, and how do you keep them going? Because you're also this itinerant brewer who is jet setting, well, not jet setting, but traveling across the country and brewing different places, like keeping cultures going. And, that's a commitment.
A lot of the cultures started in my apartment as a home brewer. I was also home brewing on top of brewing professionally and all that stuff. So I would come home and brew what I wanted to brew at home as opposed to where I was working, which was mostly mixed culture, Brett beers, nice. Things like that. I guess the way that we would approach it is we would do, in the stainless would get more of the cleaner yeast or the clean Brett strains or whatever. And then when that was done fermenting out, we would move it to barrels where we would have our like mixed culture,
right?
Our lacto and whatever. And then let that age in the barrel and, pick up some microoxidation and, pellicle and let it kind of do its thing. And then pick through our barrels, later on, like several months later, and just try to figure out what barrels would blend well together, what we could add if we were going to add any fruit or any herbs or whatever that we were, seasonal at the time or whatever.
So that 14 barrel batch would then get split into
so that
7-ish, 6.5-ish different wood barrels, or
so that would get split between exactly. Some stainless, like I said, like we had a couple Grundies. We have these 500 liter puncheons as well, a couple 400 liter puncheons, but it would get split.
Sure,
and then we would figure out what to do with it later.
So then you have to have a pretty much of a Saison base recipe then that's going to work across these different kind of cultures. How do you what'd you come up with around that?
We had about 3 different base recipes. Usually it would be all Pilsner malt, maybe a little bit of carafoam sprinkled in, or sometimes it would be like 70% Pilsner, 30% wheat,
right,
or oats, depending on
malted, unmalted.
Usually malted, malted white wheat.
Okay.
Oats, usually just like the flaked oats.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big advocate for oats. I love the protein, the mouthfeel you get from it, and all that. So.
I love that we were at Hill Farmstead yesterday, and they have an oat hopper, and oat hopper that bypasses the mill.
Okay.
But a very specific, and so you can tell how. Yeah,
nice.
There's a love of oats, but I love that it was very dedicated oat hopper within the whole malt process. Yeah,
for sure.
So, what do you find that is there a particular Pilsner malt that you like using with Saison, and and then, you are trying to then and then talk about your process then of working through that on the hot side, because especially if you're pushing these worts into mixed culture. You're probably trying to, create a little bit more unfermentable stuff, maybe not spontaneous lambic style, but
for sure,
at least some, a little more dextrinous malt or wort in order to give the culture something to work on long term.
Yeah. So we use a lot of raw Pilsner malt, North Star Pils, and Standard 2-row. That's kind of our base for mostly everything.
Yeah.
Unless we're doing now we're doing barley wines and stouts and things like that. So we kind of shifted more toward like crisp,
Okay.
Maris Otter and things like that. But for Saison particularly, we just go with a very simple recipe. Pilsner malt, malted wheat, or oats. On the hot side, it depends on what we're doing. If I'm using a clean yeast to ferment out, I'll usually shoot for higher temps in the mash. We do single infusion for pretty much everything. So
it is a old dairy tank style mash
so
tun.
our mash tun is an old dairy tank, and our false bottom is a copper pipe that I've cut slits into. So that's pretty much that. But yeah, if we're fermenting out with like a Saison strain, and it's going to be put into barrels with mixed culture or even stainless with mixed culture after primary fermentation, I'll usually mash anywhere between 152 to 156, depending on what kind of character I'm looking for. But if I'm going straight into barrel with mixed culture, I'm usually shooting for like 143, 145 mash temp, just so it doesn't get too acidic.
Okay. Let the sack do its job fast and quickly,
exactly.
and then rather than the culture creating more. Oh, that's an interesting approach.
Yeah. So that's what we do. I target mash pH 5.3.
Mm-hmm.
We're usually going out of kettle at 5. So.
Yeah, and definitely single infusion and no step mashes in this.
No, we
we
have tried. Like we're doing a lot of lagers now too. So we have done some step mashes and some decoction. Well, I should say pseudo decoctions. So we'll kind of pull wort out of the mash, boil it, and send it back over to the mash tun to raise the temp. But I've kind of moved away from all of that. It's very laborious and just a little gratuitous when you can just throw in a little melanoidin or something and get a similar effect.
If you can't taste the difference, then and I'm sure you've tried to find all of the difference you can in that.
Yeah, exactly.
Then why create the added danger, in that process too?
Exactly.
Sure. So what's on these saisons? Imagine then your hot side process is a little bit of hops, but probably not a lot. Is there anything to the way that you select hops for these?
Hops are not really something we take into consideration very much, unless we're finishing it with a dry hop or something.
Right.
Usually, if I'm looking to hop in the kettle, it's usually to kind of mitigate some of the lactic character in the beer. So 5 IBUs, 10 IBUs is probably the most we'll ever do, and
that's enough to control your culture.
Absolutely. And we don't it
hasn't learned, it hasn't trained itself up and
not quite
become IBU resistant.
Not quite. We still get some barrels that are anyway. But it's hop selection for those types of beers usually comes very late in the process, usually if we're going to be dry hopping prior to packaging. So just something mild for bittering or noble. Exactly.
Or
usually just whatever you got. Yeah, we bitter a lot with like Warrior or Columbus. So
sure. And then where do you go from there? And
then from there we'll let the ferment do its thing, age in barrel or stainless.
How long, even here in this, in the new Freak Folk space, what's the fermentation dynamic, feel like? How long does it take to crank through primary? And then how long does your culture generally, how do you maintain that over the life of that mixed culture fermentation?
Primary takes about 3 weeks before we move it to oak. Sometimes if we're going into oak, we'll just leave it right on the culture. And
it's the same culture, right? That's traveling with it, or your primary is really just going to be done by the sack strains.
So each barrel kind of has its own culture in it, So I don't know. We don't really think too much about it, I guess.
No,
we just kind of we just let the oak take care of the beer that we put in.
When you brew a saison here, you're knocking out into stainless first, or we knock out into stainless. Here, since we've moved here, we're usually doing a primary fermentation in stainless. Right.
I've kind of moved away from doing primary in barrels, but I was kind of referring to what we were doing in Queen City, just with our limited space and everything. Even though space here is also limited, But now since we've been here in Waterbury, we are doing pretty much all of our primary ferments in stainless before moving it to oak. And we will do usually a Brett fermentation or a combination of Saccharomyces and Brett before moving it to barrel. So before it's in barrel, it's, it doesn't have the acidity. It's got a little bit of funk. It's got a little bit of phenol character. But then once we move it into barrel, we'll let it age out for however long it needs to. We'll taste it periodically. Some of these barrels I haven't even tapped into to see, and they've been in the barrel for about a year. So we'll check in on them periodically and see if it's time to rack, and if we have time for it, we'll do it.
That's interesting with the primary, mostly sack fermentation. You have a fun wild sack strain, or are you just using a more typical saison strain?
It depends. I'm playing around a lot with yeast, all the time. I'm playing around with yeast.
Right. There's not one answer to this question.
Yeah, no, there really isn't. Right. We just we fuck around a lot and find out. So
what has worked and what hasn't worked on that? And we shouldn't say hasn't worked, or what has worked a little better, and what have you found a little more challenging in that process? Obviously, you can always, work and massage and help guide the fermentation to where it needs to be. Are there some methods that you found, or some yeast blends, for that primary, that have set you up in the right way?
Yeah, my favorite blend that we ferment out with right now is a combination of DuPont, and we do Brett Trois and Clausini. Those three together, it's like the holy trinity for me.
Yeah,
I love that combination before it goes into our barrels where we have our mixed culture. And the character changes drastically once it's in the barrels. But
sure.
But that initial, what I should really do is package that beer alone, because it's such a wonderful combination.
Yeah. So, what do you love about it? What is it? What flavor does that give you that you think
you get this crazy mango? There's a little bit of a phenol character that I know is a little bit offensive to some people, but I kind of like that. Yeah. It's almost like a floral kind of thing. So I get a lot of mango, floral, pineapple, and then you get the classic hay straw character.
Does that combo stay fairly stable for future pitches also, or are you having to kind of reblend to bring it back to what it is?
It stays stable for a few pitches. Okay. Our space is so limited, and we don't have that much stainless. So, honestly, after a couple generations, we usually toss it and we'll start new.
Yeah.
Eventually, but yeah, it's kind of one of those things where we just do it to kind of bulk ferment some saison, and then we throw it into a bunch of barrels and let the barrels take care of the rest.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm just it's just, especially with this multi-strain primary approach, keeping those things. I mean, yeast, it's natural selection. Something's going to want to win out over the other ones, and so maintaining that stability in a culture, that's its own fun
exactly
challenge.
So experiencing that strain, that combination of yeast, generation upon generation, that's not something that we actually have that much experience with. It's just we pitch it a couple times and then we toss it.
So then you move from that kind of primary fermentation then into barrels, where you have even more complex cocktail of microbes to do more longer term aging. Tell me about that.
Yeah, and so once we move to oak, it depends on what character we're looking for. We have some gin barrels, we have some neutral reds, some neutral whites, and we just kind of go through. We'll taste different blend or different barrels and see what would marry well with another barrel. Our blending capacity is a little bit challenging. We have some 3-barrel Grundies that I have out back that I haven't shown you yet, but just these weird little 3-barrel Grundies that's essentially what we package off of. So we kind of select barrels according to what we can fit in our Grundy. If that makes sense.
Oh, totally makes sense.
And
right.
Yeah, it's a little arbitrary, but we can get some good flavors just pulling off of a couple different barrels and blending. Since we've have this tap room. We've tried to do
I
some.
mean, being able to make your Saison blends in 3-barrel batches is probably an actual benefit these days. And
True.
that,
True. Yeah.
you know, that matches the volume of sales for those kinds of things.
Yeah. It's, you know, Saison sales have kind of plummeted since COVID. So
Let's bring it back. Bring it back.
Exactly.
And so your blending, you know, pulls in based on, you know, the tank skies that you're gonna bottle off of.
Yeah, and then we, you know, it depends on what we're looking for. Like, you know, we do a couple different things with foraged ingredients, like sumac. That Stagler is actually, the sumac's added on the hot side, so that beer is specifically brewed for Stagler. A lot of our beers are kind of like just brewed as a saison, and we'll figure it out once it's in barrels, like what's going to happen with it.
Sure.
We have another beer called Signet that's we do every year, where we grow marigolds. We have a garden. My wife has a crazy garden at the house, and she grows marigolds, and we use the marigolds in the batch of beer. So that beer is super special for us, and we try to select our favorite barrels for that. And usually what I'm looking for on that is a little bit of like color from the barrel. I'm looking for some like tangerine notes, that kind of thing that will kind of marry well with the herbal character of the marigolds. Because we actually don't use, I see a lot of brewers using just the flower on the marigold. They'll go through and just pick the flowers. We just rip the entire plant out of the ground, rinse off the dirt, and throw the entire foliage into the tank. And I personally think that most of the character from marigold comes from the actual like stems.
Really?
Absolutely.
So what do you describe that character as? It
almost has like a mild like basil type of character. Like it's a little minty, lemon balmy kind of thing. Yeah.
Interesting that would be, you know, I mean, you can see why brewers would not think or want to use more of that green matter with the assumption that that's going to add a kind of stocky or, you know, celery or that kind of vegetal character into it. But but interesting, there could be as many flavor compounds there as in the flower itself.
Yeah, it was kind of this weird epiphany I had when we actually rented a community garden in the town that we live in, and we just happened to be growing some marigolds that year. We weren't planning on putting it in a beer, but we were harvesting some veggies, and I was kind of like just smelling the flower, and I was like, holy shit, this foliage is crazy. We should put this in a beer. And it just became a thing. And just use the whole plant.
Talk to me about some of the other ingredients that you find yourself going back to, what foraged or not. You know, because this kind of herbal floral, you know, approach to saison is something that you know, the beers that I've had from you have been really interesting. And there's a character to it, but it's also not overdone. It's also balanced, nicely integrated with the overall flavor of the fermentation of the beer itself. What are some of the other fun ones you?
We do a beer called Color Haze. We haven't done one in a little bit, but Color Haze is a blended mixed culture beer. Sometimes we pull from stainless, sometimes we pull from oak, and then we choose what kind of dry hop we're going to add to it. In the previous years, it's been local. We have a local hop farmer, Champlain Valley Hops. They do a great job. So we'll kind of get some like wet hops from them, essentially, in the fall when they're harvesting their cones. We'll go and pick some up, and we'll add it to a finished beer.
Right.
So it's like a wet hopped, on a finished beer, which is kind of cool. So that character is pretty cool. It creates some like a little bit of a
Breakside's entire wet hop approach to IPA. Yeah.
Okay, that's cool.
Cold side, whole cone hop addition,
nice.
Maceration, soak. So yeah,
right on. Yeah, I mean, we might be moving a little bit kind of away from the whole local thing, because the last couple of years that we did Color Haze, I mean, I just think the growing season in Vermont isn't really a great thing for hop growers or even malt growers on the East Coast. I think it's very challenging. So so I think we're going to kind of move away from the local thing and kind of do more pellets and, hops that we love to use in our IPAs and things like that, and kind of move Color Haze into that direction, have it be more.
What hops do you want to play with in that you just can't because they're local?
The last one we did. Well, I'm a huge fan of like New Zealand hops, so like Nelson and
Right.
I love Nelson, Rakau, Rawaka, Motueka is nice. So like using those
Look
kind
at
of hops.
this Hazy IPA influence is like creeping into your saison.
Yeah, it's like
it's okay. It's okay.
It's like a cancer.
Cancer. It's more like a beneficial. Well,
But yeah, I mean, just hops that I love using cold side for our IPAs. I'd like to kind of do that with our mixed culture, have it be more of like a mirrored image, but with mixed culture. You know what I mean?
Sure. Are there any other interesting ingredients beyond hops that find their way into your saison, or are there some characters of some of the specific cultures, separate cultures that you maintain here in barrels that express themselves kind of in a singular way that you love sharing just as their own things?
Yeah, I mean, we have some cultures that I really love that have come from our old space. A lot of those cultures, we ended up getting rid of a lot of our barrels, so we kind of had to start fresh here. But there has been a little bit of carryover. And one of our cultures comes from the Lodestar, which is one of our first batches of saison that we ever produced and released. That culture is a blend of the holy trio that I just mentioned, plus dregs that I've propped up from Drew Fontenot bottles. And so that character in that culture, I love. It's like lemon. I get this like almost like slightly goozy funk that I absolutely love. Kind of like that barnyard hay kind of thing.
Sure.
Or twine, I like to call it.
Twine.
Yeah, like a twiney character. That's my favorite character in any mixed culture beer. If you can dial in that like that twine, that barnyard twine character, like that is like that's the character I want in a mixed culture beer.
Absolutely. Do you use aged hops at all?
I don't know.
Huh.
Yeah.
So you're able to kind of capture some of that funk character without aged hops.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Then how do you finish saison from there? Obviously, carbonation, high carbonation is what makes these beers expressive. How do you? What's the end of your process look like?
It's essentially just like we will blend into a tank and we add, depending on what we're doing with the beer, I guess. We'll condition out with honey or maple syrup or mostly corn sugar. I mean, that's kind of what our fermentables are usually in the bottle. Sure. But we'll condition to we'll shoot for about 3 volumes of pressure and then let it condition. Usually our bottles have to condition for 3 or 4 months before we can release it.
Right.
Because they go through weird phases of diacetyl and just THP and that kind of thing. So we'll let it rest out.
It's pretty cool up here in Vermont for a good portion of the year too. So
yeah, absolutely.
It's not like you have a dedicated warm room here for bottle conditioning like they do.
Nope. We age all our bottles right here in the tap room.
Yeah.
so you can see them all laying horizontally in the cages.
I love the gigantic warm room at Ommegang in New York, where of course they're bottle conditioning everything, and so it's just gigantic warm warehouse.
When I was at Mystic, they had a warm tent. They had like a big tent in their warehouse that they just pushed all the bottles into.
Sure.
I wish we had something like that, but we're pretty limited on space here.
It's a small little brewery here. Sure. Well, let's change gears and let's talk about Hazy IPA because I told people we would. And obviously you as a saison maker have also post-pandemic, branched out now, especially as you have your own brewery here. You're able to make Hazy IPA and that's what people want. And you found a creative path into making Hazy IPA as well. Yeah. And, I've got this thesis that came up, through basically a Slack conversation I was having with Kate Bernat and Joe Stang. We were talking about finding IPA makers that build the most character into their hazy IPAs, and we started realizing that there's a strange correlation between saison makers who also make really great hazy IPA. And if you start thinking about folks like Monkish, even Hill Farmstead. There's a lot of crossover between great hazy IPA and great saison. And of course, here you are doing it at Freak Folk in the same kind of way. And so I want to dive into that saison maker's approach to hazy IPA. Before we do that, the latest product from Yakima Chief Hops, YCH 702, is a flowable extract designed to maximize aroma and increase whirlpool yield. YCH 702 is a flowable at room temperature, standardized to 20% total oil, and contains high concentration of survivable hop compounds, which increases the chances of the aroma showing up in the final beer. 1 kilogram of YCH 702 equates to 10 kilograms of T90 pellets. YCH 702 Citra, Mosaic, Simcoe, and Sabro are available. Contact your Yakima Chief Hop rep for more information. Also, if you're opening or expanding a brewery, getting your building right is one of the most important things you'll ever do. The architects at OPA Design Studio are your partners in developing the unique design you need. With over a decade of experience designing breweries, the folks at OPA are here to serve as your trusted experts from start to finish with their full range of architectural services. Visit designopa.com to set up your no obligation introductory consultation today. All right, Ryan, let's talk about hazy IPA.
That's a good segue. We use 702.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Nice. A lot of folks are going that direction, especially on this small scale where yield when you're brewing a 7-barrel batch is extra important for you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well,
let's talk about from a creative standpoint. When you decided you were going to, start making hazy IPA and make that a pretty big core of Freak Folk, how'd you start designing hazy IPA?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. I've always loved IPAs and I've always brewed them for other companies, Tired Hands and all that. So I've always loved IPAs. My wife loves IPAs. And I've been having a ton of fun brewing them on our system. We just celebrated our 2-year anniversary last month, and it took me about 2 years to really find where we wanted our IPAs to be. So that was an interesting thing. So it was about 2 years of tinkering with recipes and trying to figure out like what malts to use. I've been really focused on the grain bill. Sure. Overall. That's kind of been my main focus and trying to get that like opaque white color in our hazy IPAs. And
so where were the dead ends? And talk to me about some of the things that you've discovered in building the kind of malt bill that you want for your hazy IPAs.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's all like a personal preference. When I first started, we were kind of playing around with adding like honey malt, like a little bit of honey malt, to our IPAs, things like that. Raw wheat, which I found that I don't really care for in IPA. Even wheat in general, I feel like sometimes is a little bit polarizing for myself. I get more of like almost like a simple sugar kind of character from wheat. That's
so
just
team oats,
I'm team oats big time. Okay. Yeah. So our grain bill
but you're
now,
right, and even up here, like you've got different expressions of this. Like that Treehouse Julius is this orange color, and it needs to be that kind of orangey, and so their approach to malt is going to be, and what some people want out of it does have more of that color. While at the same time, there's other directions that are going much more pale and light and low color. So talk to me about that.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, occasionally I do use a little bit of wheat. I'll sprinkle some malted white wheat here and there just to see, like, revisit and see if I do like it, but our base recipe now has shifted to essentially like 60 to 70% either 2-row or Pilsner. Sometimes I blend the two. And then the rest will make up in oats, usually a combination of flaked oats, malted oats.
A blend of 2-row and Pilsner.
Yeah.
Cool. That sounds more complex than it needs to be. Why?
I think that, I don't know. We do like a blend of 2-row and Pilsner. I feel like Pilsner malt doesn't have like a ton of expressive malt character. And so when I'm shooting for a little bit of a blend of Pilsner and 2-row, I'm kind of cutting back on the character of the 2-row You know what if that makes sense?
Absolutely.
And it's focusing more on like highlighting the hop character. Sometimes we'll do 100%, or, what we make up of 2-row, it will be standard 2-row malt. And I do like that character a lot, but sometimes.
And you're small and using bagged malt.
Yeah,
so it's
exactly.
not like,
and
it's not like you have to use what you've got in a silo out there.
Right. We get everything pre-milled too. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Go through country malt and raw, but everything gets pre-milled. We don't have a mill here, so it's pretty small.
It's easier in this building with other tenants in it, and shared use to not have to have a grain cracking room built into the small space. I get it.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more then about you've dialed this in. Are there some specific varieties of?
I wouldn't say that I've dialed anything in. I'm still playing around.
Sure.
I'm still playing around quite a bit, tinkering.
And this will also change in the future, right? I mean, it's
Absolutely.
never. This is just a moment in time. This is not a definitive statement forever.
Absolutely, yeah. So going back to the blend of 2-row and Pilsner. So when I blend in the Pilsner, it's just to dial back the character of the malt is essentially what I'm trying to do.
Sure. While also using it to keep that color light.
Keep the color light. Exactly. As you know, standard 2-row is a little bit darker than Pilsner malt and that kind of thing. So it's also to achieve color. And when I say tinkering, we're still tinkering. Like just this batch, these 3 IPAs that we're canning tomorrow, they all have different yeast strains. So it's like we're still playing around with different yeasts, trying to figure out what we like.
That. What are the parameters you're changing with this, the strains, temperature, fermentation, and how they interact with, the grist, the malt. What are you hoping to learn, and what yeast are you playing with right now?
Well, I don't want to give too much away on the house blend. I have a house blend.
A house blend.
Yeah.
Okay.
That I've kind of come up with that I love. I love the character of it.
Sure.
I get a lot of passion fruit mango characters out of it, and I don't want to get rid of that. But what I'm doing is like trying to explore other yeasts. We have an experimental series called the Cult of Billy. In that series, we play around with different techniques, different yeast strains, different ingredients, that kind of thing. So that's the whole premise of that thing. So
sure.
So we're playing around with some dry yeast in this next Cultability. It's the UK yeast that they've developed with Lallemand, Verdant IPA.
Okay.
So that one's going to be kind of interesting. It's very like citrusy, tangerine. Very different from our regular house strain. So.
Well, that's interesting to me. So how, now that you are playing with similar grist bill and different yeast and fermentation approaches, what is the range that you're sensing from these different fermentations?
What we're looking for is just like what kind of profile we're going to get from different levels of attenuation, that kind of thing. So we have 2 double IPAs that we're canning tomorrow. They both received the exact same grain bill, the exact same mashing regimen, pretty much the same hopping regimen, different hops, but same regimen.
Yeah.
Just different yeast, and trying to see like the different characteristics of those. And do we want to move toward this dry yeast, or do we want to keep our house blend kind of thing? And I love our house blend. I don't think we're going to change that.
But you're constantly challenging it.
Yeah,
right?
We're challenging it for sure. Yeah.
What is the other yeast? So Verdant is one of the yeasts. And what's the other yeast?
Yeah. We've played around with London 3 quite a bit. We were using that for probably like the vast majority of the 2 years that we were tinkering. Right. So for our IPAs now, we usually mash in about 155. And then, pH.
Trying to leave them kind of sweet, huh?
Trying to leave them sweet, yeah. We're trying to achieve, like most of our IPAs finish like 5.5 Plato.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, sometimes 6 even, depending on what we're looking for. The bigger the beer, the lower the final gravity we're shooting for. But yeah, shoot for
the
about...
The bigger the beer, the lower the final gravity.
Yeah. So if we're doing like a triple IPA or double IPA, I'm shooting for like 4.8 to 5 Plato.
That seems mildly counterintuitive.
Yeah, but I think like, the bigger beers, you end up with a little bit of like alcohol sweetness.
Right.
That kind of helps, kind of amplifies those flavors. I don't want it to taste like cloying or anything like that. So
where the single IPA with all of the 6.5 to 7% has to have extra body there to support these strong hop characters.
Exactly. But yeah,
this is going to sound strange, but I just had a deja vu moment, as if I had somehow already had this conversation
really?
with you and just dreamed it at some point in the past.
Interesting.
I don't understand that.
Okay.
But a strange one. Yeah. In my memory, I said something really dumb and screwed that up. But somehow we kept that moment there. Sorry, that's an aside. Totally off topic here.
That's all good.
But very strange that I don't know why I'm so neurotic that I have dreams about messing up podcasts. But I do, and so there we are. So let's talk. Let's keep talking about the way that your yeasts aid in hop expression in these hazy IPAs. Now you've got these 3 different yeasts fermenting here with some similar kind of hop loads. What have you found in the way that those different yeasts, affect the way that those hops express?
Yeah. So some of the yeasts that we've used, namely London 3, some other English yeasts that we've played around with, I felt like those didn't really express the way I wanted them to. I felt like they've finished a little bit too like they didn't really leave too much on the palate, and what I'm looking for when I'm choosing yeast is for hazy IPAs particularly, what I want is like a powdery kind of mouthfeel, and like powdery and pillowy. Without having to like throw in a shitload of calcium chloride. Like I'm looking for balance in the water profile and that kind of thing too. So,
and you don't want it to go chalky. It needs to be pillowy, but not chalky. So we found this combination of yeast, for our house blend, if you want to call it that. It has these like really awesome mango passion fruit characters, but it also leaves behind this like powdery mouthfeel that I find desirable. And it all works as a system, right? It's the malt that you're choosing, and it's your water chemistry. Do you do anything special with your water up here?
Waterbury has pretty soft water overall.
We try living up to its namesake.
Yeah, exactly. We try to keep it fairly soft. With the calcium chloride, I'm usually shooting for anywhere between 125 parts per million to 250 parts per million. So, and then gypsum will shoot for 75 usually. 75 to 80 parts per million.
Mm-hmm.
pH is a big thing. We're mashing at 155. I'm shooting for like a pH of 5.3 to 5.4. And then once we're leaving the kettle, I'll usually give it a lactic boost to get it down to like 4.9 sometimes even.
And then where does that end up finishing?
We finish the IPAs.
Post-fermentation pH.
Post-fermentation pH is usually around 4.3 to 4.4.
I have to ask this question after our hazy IPA panel. Sure. When Kelsey and Evan are talking about some of the folks finishing high fours, and almost to 5, which is a little insane.
4.6 is probably the highest our post dry hop usually turns out.
That's that food safety level right there.
Yeah, I've never explored it above that, so I don't really know.
Well, there you go. No, cool.
Yeah,
but at those various points pH, like they certainly impact the way that the hops express, and
Yeah, I feel like if there's a little bit of like an acidic backbone to the beer, it's going to amplify the hops. I feel like the higher pH, at least in theory, it's going to be more muddled. That's just what I have in my head. I don't know if that's actually the truth.
Sure.
Yeah. So that's why we do that. And then we do, anywhere between 6 to 8 days of primary fermentation. We usually go for about 2 or 3 days of finished gravity before we dry hop, yeast off and dry hop.
Really?
Yeah.
2 to 3 days. That's a good space between. It's a horribly inefficient from a production standpoint.
Yeah, we were dry hop in the beginning. We were dry hopping right at the tail end of fermentation, and so it was still a little active.
Right.
And what I found when we did that was we were getting a lot of like grassy, bitter notes that I wasn't really a fan of.
Interesting.
And then once we started dry hopping later, the the hops were more expressive, and it was a lot more palatable. So
it's interesting to see where all of this research is going on this. That you either need to dry hop right at the very start, but this mid fermentation dry hopping seems to be the worst for haze stability and for some of that expression.
I don't know where that came from.
But then some people are having a great experience with it. So it's all. There's no one answer that fits everybody.
Yeah, I think it's really just a matter of like what you prefer and what your system can handle, and that's essentially it.
So you'll pull yeast and then you'll let it sit for 2 or 3 more days then?
No, so we'll do 6 to 8 days of primary fermentation. I will let it sit at the final gravity for a couple days, and then we'll pull yeast and dry hop that same day.
Okay. So you pull yeast, dry hop, and then have you then crashed temperature at that point? Where do you keep temperature on the tank?
We've played around with like a little bit of like soft crashing.
Yeah.
Once it's at final gravity for a day or two, we'll soft crash it down to 60 before pulling yeast and then dry hopping. But I haven't really found too much of a benefit from that, so we just kind of keep it. Whatever the temperature is when it finishes is where we'll let it sit for a couple days, and then we'll pull yeast, dry hop. I'll usually...
And that dry hop stays at this kind of...
At this temperature, okay. usually around like 67, 68 degrees.
Sure.
We ferment at like 68 degrees,
right.
Most of our beers. But usually 5 days on dry hop. And then
5 days?
5 days.
5 days.
5 days.
Okay. All right.
And then we...
Why that much? I mean... again, like the risk would, if I'm thinking about other brewers dry hopping, there are some that want to take it off 24 hours, and if you leave it any longer, it's going to have too much polyphenol pickup and too much of the kind of burny character, or, obviously you need those polyphenols for some of that haze too, but 5 days is a long time.
Yeah, like I said, we've been tinkering for a long time, like the 2 years of just exploring
sure.
How we're going to do these IPAs or approach these IPAs. And, we in the beginning, we were doing, you would crash after like 3 days on dry hop, 2 days on dry hop. And what I found was you'd get a lot more, there was a lot more risk of VDK, diacetyl pickup,
sure.
That kind of thing. We were getting hop burn, that kind of thing. So we've figured if we let it sit for longer, maybe more will settle out before we crash it, and that'll benefit the IPA. And that's what we're doing. And
do you do any kind of rousing or anything to kind of aid extraction there? Or?
Not typically, because we'll cap like a day before final gravity, so it builds up a little bit of pressure. There's probably a little bit of natural carbonation in there, and then we'll dry hop it there, and then we'll see like. The beer will pick up again. It'll get active again for another couple days. And so we'll see the pressure
getting a little
rise.
bit of creep there.
And so you're going to see the hops are going to naturally just kind of
get going again.
Yeah. They'll be resuspended.
Gotcha.
So we don't really rouse anymore. I'll just put a little bit of pressure on the tank after I dry hop. And
sure. Yeah. You talked about loving New Zealand hops, how do you, when it comes to your approach to building hop blends and then, selecting or trying to, optimize specific characters within the hops so that they express the way that you want them to in your hazy IPAs. Like, how do you go about that hop selection process?
Yeah.
I mean, you're really small, so it's not hop selection in terms of
we're not
choosing lots or whatnot.
Yeah, I wish we could, but that's not the case.
Sure.
We're just buying mostly on spot markets.
Yeah.
But I'm a big advocate for Citra. That's kind of my jam, and I know it's like a kind of a typical.
It's not a hot
thing.
take, yeah.
So, it's not a hot take, and it's kind of contradictory to my contrarian comment earlier. But yeah, we do quite a bit of Citra. That's kind of like the building block for the IPA. We'll have our base recipe, and then Citra is kind of the main component to that, hot side and cold side. But then we build onto that. So we'll sprinkle in some Nelson or. I love these New Zealand hops. I feel like they play really well. Some of them are very tropical, very pineapple-y, very lemony. Some of them have like this kind of dank dieselness to them that I also really like, in like Nelson.
Sure.
And I think that plays well with Citra. I think so.
Yeah.
So you'll see most of our beers have Citra in them.
Right. You mentioned using 702 earlier.
Yep.
Do you find yourself using more cryo or advanced hop products? And
we use a lot of
how
cryo.
do you use them?
Yeah, we use a lot of cryo. We use 702 in the whirlpool. We've played around with 702 and incognito. We've done like knockout, where we knock out a little bit hot for like a barrel or two with the 702 or the incognito, and we've done whirlpool with the 702 and incognito. And I've kind of liked just the whirlpool personally.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just, I like the character. I like letting it sit with the oils for a while. I do like a 30-minute hop stand at like 170.
Huh. It's a little bit of a cool pool there.
A little bit of a cool pool. Yeah, I'll just run it through the heat-X and then back into the kettle before I whirl and do my.
What do you find that adds to it? Or subtracts for that?
Yeah,
matter.
it subtracts bitterness. You're getting more flavor at those lower temperatures, and I'll do like a half hour of rest with my whirlpool before sending it to the fermenter, and I love that character. We usually go about, depending on the beer, but anywhere between 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds per barrel in the whirl, and sometimes it's supplemented with 702 or incognito.
Yeah. And then dry hopping. What's dry hopping like?
Dry hopping, we're about 4.7 to 5.5 pounds per barrel, depending on the beer.
Oof.
Yeah.
Boy.
Yeah. So it's quite a bit.
That's a lot of dry hop to be sitting for 5 days.
Yeah. I mean, we say 5 days, but I will do like slow dump. So I will dump off the bottom of the tank as the hops settle out. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's also an expensive way to lose beer on
Absolutely.
a 7-barrel system.
Absolutely.
Right here.
Yeah. So our yields aren't very good. So,
but
for me, it's more about the quality than it is the quantity. I mean, but yeah,
you get to do that because it's small. You're selling most of the beer, most of the beer out of your tap room here. And
I kettle up to about 8 barrels in the kettle.
Okay.
And when we're done boiling and post knockout, we've got about 7.5. Maybe 7.2. But then when we yield about 4.5 barrels.
Oh, it's just heartbreaking.
I know. Trust me, I know.
Brutal. Well, you're loving the quality of what you make that much to lose that much is absolutely crazy. You ever replacing dry hop with cryo or more concentrated hop products in order to try to squeeze more yield out?
So that's kind of the crazy thing. We do use a lot of cryo, but I'm just kind of adding it as if it were just regular T90s.
Oh man. Melting people's faces with intense hop character there. Anything else interesting to the way that you make Hazy IPA?
Not really. That's pretty much it.
What's your favorite combination of hops that you've released so far?
I am a big fan of Citra and Rawaka. I love that combination. You get these awesome stone fruit character alongside these like tropical notes. Rawaka is just such an awesome hop. There's also a little bit of like a black pepper kind of character that I also enjoy with that hop. So Citra, Rawaka, I love. Galaxy sprinkled in there just a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm not a big fan of like the big Galaxy beers, but if it's added just enough, it can be quite wonderful.
Someone else was just telling me that on the podcast within the last month.
Okay.
Interesting to see how like just little bits of Galaxy, but not a lot of Galaxy.
Yeah, you don't want too much.
It's also great, just for it's such a good haze positive, hop and helps build that.
I feel like most of the New Zealand strains are hops are very haze positive.
Sure.
You get that white opaque character just from dry hopping with them,
right?
Which is pretty cool.
Well, as we finish up here, let's pull out and look at the big picture. You've brewed a lot of places over a lot of years and also all parts of the country. A couple of years ago, you were able to kick in and have now your own Freak Folk brewery here in Waterbury, your own tap room. You and Lillian. What do you hope to achieve next? What does the next 3 to 5 years look like for Freak Folk?
Personally, I would like to do a little bit of a transition out of this space here in Waterbury, and maybe turn it into more of a restaurant type of thing, and move the production somewhere else. That's kind of like the next step. What I'd love to do is build a barn on our property, and then do most of our production there. We have excellent water at our house. We have Lil and I just bought a house a couple years ago, so we're all excited about just having property. We've got 10 acres. And
you went from a cabin in the woods to a house in the woods. All right.
Yeah. So
next is going to be your brewing in your barn in the woods.
Exactly. Brewing in the barn, and then just bringing down whatever we need to feed the tap room and retail. So, and hopefully have a little restaurant serving some really nice food.
I love it. I love this Vermont story of brewing in the barn. I was just in a barn yesterday with Vasily from Wonderkammer, and I guess the brew house is kind of it's not really a barn. It's really
more of a shed.
More of a shed.
Yeah.
And then the fermentation cellar is more of a bunker, a former cheese cave,
right.
Underground.
It's exactly where I would want to be if there was a nuclear bomb.
Yeah.
Dropped.
But I love this. Approach to brewing that's a little bit different, a little more, it's part of this long tradition in Vermont of taking the things that you grow in Vermont and then making things that add more value and last longer from those things, whether that's, the dairy milk that you turn into cheese or, or whatnot. So long history of that, adding value to agriculture here.
Yeah. And if we were to move production out of this space, it would kind of free up some time for me to do more blending and more saison production, which I would love to do. Unfortunately, right now we just don't have the space for it, and I don't have the time for it. It's like I'm tied up with so many other things.
Well, there's many experiments left to be had as you continue to develop and evolve and figure out where you take things next. And I think that is a great place to bring this to a close. Choose G&D Chillers on your next expansion or brewery startup and receive 1 free year of remote control and monitoring. Take your operations to the next level with the experts at ProBrew. Old Orchard is the go-to source for fruit-forward ingredients for some of the biggest names in the craft brewing landscape. Omega Yeast's Diacetyl Knockout series is comprised of 8 familiar yeast strains engineered to knock out the formation of diacetyl before it starts. ABS Commercial are proud to offer brewhouses, tanks, keg washers, and preventative maintenance parts to brewers across the country. If you're a distiller or curious about it, check out the Craft Spirits and Distilling podcast. YCH 702 is a flowable extract designed to maximize aroma and increase whirlpool yield. And the architects at OPA Design Studio are your partners in developing the unique design you need. If you've enjoyed this podcast, go to beerandbrewing.com, click on that subscribe button, support us in our mission to bring you the best brewing content anywhere with some of the best and most inspiring brewers all around the world. Ryan, if people want to learn more about Freak Folk, where do they find you?
You can come straight to our tap room at 28 Stowe Street in downtown Waterbury, Vermont. We also have an Instagram. That's mostly where we post our information. Our handle is at Freak Folk Beer. Beer is spelled with an I, so I-E-R. It's kind of a funny little homage. I was born in Germany, so it's kind of... our website, freakfolkbeer.com.
Well, Ryan, for your first podcast, you crushed it. Thank you for talking to me for your very first podcast. I know you're a little nervous about it going in, but we had a great conversation here.
Well, thank you, Jimmy.
Appreciate you sharing your thoughts and approach to brewing.
Thanks for visiting.
Gleaned over years and years and years of brewing all over the country. Yeah. Cheers.
Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those who love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.